For Mother Earth.
지구를 위해서.
Für Mutter Erde.
Pela Mãe Terra.
Heard around the world, welcome to the Rock Talk podcast with your host, Dave Stein.
So, I'm here today with my special guest, Tim Hazlet, and he is here today to discuss a little bit about some water for World Water Day. If you would like to give us a little background, Tim, about kind of your beginning here.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. I currently work for a firm called H2M, Architects and Engineers, and they're headquartered in Melville, Long Island, and they have a long 86-year history of working in the New York metro area on water resource projects and architecture as well, as they evolved as a company, but their roots are in water. And I work out of the Parsippany, New Jersey office.
I'll start just by asking you another question here. So,
okay.
So Tim, what do you think got your start and your love for geology? What made you want to get into this field?
Well, there were two things specifically. The first was that I grew up in Pennsylvania, and really not too far away from some of the large anthracite coal deposits that are found in northeastern Pennsylvania. And some weekends, my father would take me out to these large piles of refuse from the coal mining. They call them slag piles, and I would hunt for fossils because the stuff that was cast aside as slag usually was shaly type rock, and all this stuff formed during the Carboniferous, so it was absolutely loaded with all kinds of very interesting plant fossils. And I definitely enjoyed that, and it sparked my interest in kind of the depth of geologic time and just how amazing that was. But specifically the water side of things, I became aware of and interested in. I didn't even know that hydrogeology existed as a science necessarily, but I grew up on a farm, and so we had some summers where on our farm and my grandfather's farm we had wells that ran dry, and so some of those wells were very old, from the 1800s or even earlier. They were dug wells, so they were manually constructed and lined with limestone, and they weren't very deep, only about 25, 26 feet deep. And when those ran dry, we of course had to find another source of water for both the farm use and household use. And so watching the drill rigs come out and watching them drill and just being exposed to what came up out of the ground, and it was just fascinating to me. So I think that's where my interest got started. I realized at that point, as a pretty young kid, that water is just crucial, and I don't care what you're doing, but it's not only crucial to life at a very fundamental level, but if you look at the Googles and Facebooks and all these people that are enjoying massive computing power to run their businesses, they're also enjoying massive amounts of water to cool these computing facilities, for example. And it's amazing how it touches on aspects of even our very technological world today.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. It is crucial to have good clean water running, and it pretty much powers so much stuff. I don't think a lot of people kind of overlook how important it is. And what were some of your major project successes that you'd like to share regarding with the water, the hydrogeology side of things?
Well, I think a couple stand out to me. One that I'm probably most proud of that's right in this area up here is back in the 90s and through 2007 or so, I had a company that did specialized geological modeling, and we, as a very small company, got involved with one of the largest projects that New York City's ever done, which is called the East Side Access Project. And the goal of the East Side Access Project was to take the incoming trains from the Long Island Railroad and put them into an underground tunnel system, which would cross under the East River, under Manhattan, and then head south to Grand Central Terminal. And I got started on that project in the late 90s, or right around 2000 maybe, and they're still completing the Grand Central end of that now. But the modeling that I did, both looking at the complex glacial materials on that portion of Long Island, in the Long Island City area, in relation to contamination from a rail yard that had more than 150 years of history to it. Just in that kind of complex geology in a complex urban setting, there was a lot of decisions that were made off the models that I produced, and I'm very proud of that. And I still see today sometimes graphics that I produced years ago in presentations by the city or the state. So I'd say that's one example. Yeah, and another one was different angle altogether, which was more towards the environmental side of things, in the broad sense of protecting water resources and tied into planning. I did a number of projects like this in Florida, the most recent being one for Collier County, Florida, which is on the southwest coast of Florida, and it includes some towns and cities like Naples, for example, Marco Island, places that people like to vacation or retire to. And this is on the edge of the Everglades, and some portions of it include Everglades land. And so the big picture question there was, how do you manage growth and the demands for more water, and also balance that with the environment's need for water and recreational water use and industrial water use and other competing, in some instances, competing interests. And so the modeling that I was involved with down there took all these factors and came up with basically optimized outcomes that it's like any good compromise. The sides aren't entirely happy. They don't get exactly what they want, but they're happy enough to make an agreement, and that's what happened there. And that the underpinned essentially what became legislation that dictated how very large areas of land would be used over many years to come, with that balance in mind. And of course, water was at the core of that. That's the point. Is that all of these different things that I mentioned all depended on water, and not only clean water, but plentiful water as well. So it's a water quality and water quantity issue.
Oh, nice. That's pretty awesome. How much work have you done and related to watershed management and urban flooding and flood forecasting? Is that something that you have done quite a bit of work in?
Yeah, I've done work that's all of that to some degree. I'll give you an example of in that same area. Actually, there's an active flood forecasting system in that same area of Florida that I was involved with the development of that. And basically, in Florida, one of the big problems, and this is actually a big problem with predicting floods in general, is that when there is rainfall, it does not reach the ground in a very predictable, spatially distributed fashion. So what you end up with is a storm, like a hurricane in Florida, a hurricane that the track that it's more or less going to take within, let's say, 10 or 12 hours. It can have a pretty tight track that's pretty predictable. But what you don't know is where it's going to put down all that rain, and it can vary quite a bit spatially. And so Florida's way to handle that is to have a vast network of essentially lakes, which are used as storage, and canals, which are used to divert water from one part of the state or county to another. And so the flood forecasting system that's used down there takes the storm track information and predicts ahead of time where the most, the highest likelihood of flooding is within the domain of the model that's running, and it can essentially tell the county services or the emergency services, whoever it is, where roads will be flooded out. They can warn people ahead of time to move out of an area, because if they don't within a certain amount of time, they're not going to be able to get out. And it also tells them operationally how to operate the structures on the canals. So these would be things like gates, for example, to close a gate and hold water in the canal, or to open a gate and let it out to relieve what is predicted to be high or flood stage waters in that area. And so that's probably one of the more sophisticated models that I know of. There are a lot of riverine models, but why that is sophisticated is because this includes not only the storm tracking of the incoming event, but it also accounts for groundwater flow and surface water flow and operations within the lake and or storage and canal networks.
Okay, that's pretty amazing. How much does having the city around that area influence how much flooding there is related? I mean, does the pavement and the buildings and the asphalt all play a large part, or is that something that is actually not as big of a factor?
Well, I think on that side, it's still, the west coast of Florida is still relatively undeveloped compared to the East Coast. So if we're going to talk about urban flooding, I would go to Broward County as a really good example of what happens there. And what Broward County does, and I was involved with modeling a 3-county area there with kind of centered on Broward. And they essentially they used to just either run their water off to the ocean, or they would run it off to some very large basins that they constructed on the edge of the Everglades. If you look at Broward County on a map, you can see that the eastern half, which includes places like Fort Lauderdale, et cetera, that is highly urbanized along the coast and has a lot of runoff to manage. And so they had this basic system, but the modeling that was done, which took many years, and it was done in a sequence of 3 very large models, and those were put together. What that showed was that there were other ways that the stormwater could be managed, and in fact, it came down to some of these operational controls that I mentioned for the other side of the state, but it also came down to things like capturing some of that water and essentially re-injecting it in some of their well fields, because they try not to waste the water if they can help it. So there was kind of it's not really reuse technically speaking, but it's an infiltration or injection type of scheme to try to keep as much water available, because once you put it out to sea, it's gone for the dry times. So the whole runoff thing can be kind of a blessing, and a curse at the same time. If you have good ways to capture the water and you have the storage to do it, it can be a blessing if it's managed well, and if it's not, then you end up with flooding. And of course, that portion of Florida still experiences flooding, and it's not a totally perfectly managed system, but I think they're doing pretty well.
Okay, very nice. My next question for you is, how familiar are you with the red tide that they've been having over there, and is that a big issue? I've seen a lot about up there, and I've kind of researched it a little bit, but it sounds like you've worked quite a bit in that area, so I'm just kind of curious, as a water expert, what are your thoughts on that situation?
Well, Florida's there's a number of different tides, so to speak. These are all related to algal blooms that it's related to the nutrients in the water. And in Florida, primarily, the center of the state, if you were to go from Naples to Miami across the southern tier of the state, that used to be called Alligator Alley, and that cuts across the Everglades. And to the north of there is a huge agricultural area where a vast portion of the strawberries, tomatoes, and a lot of the early season produce that you see in the stores is grown. And to grow that, they fertilize the fields, and they use fertilizers that are full of so-called nutrients like nitrates and phosphates, things like that. And that gets into the groundwater. In Florida, you're basically talking about a state that is, it's a state that's a big block of limestone, karst limestone with sand on top of it. And so the sand, whatever's put on the surface, it pretty well goes through the sand and down into the groundwater and moves to the south into the Lake Okeechobee area. And Lake Okeechobee is originally a natural feature. It's a remnant of earlier times in Florida, and it was a little inland sea, essentially left behind when the glaciers lowered sea level, and it captures all that nutrient-laden water. And there are two very large canals that one goes off to the east and one goes off to the west. And during a storm event, Okeechobee has been engineered to hold water in exactly the case of a storm, a very large storm. And it has a large dike around it called the Herbert Hoover Dike, named after the president. Not the president, the head of the FBI, I guess. Actually, I'm not sure who it's. You'll have to edit that out. but it is the Herbert Hoover Dike, and the long and short of it is Okeechobee gets loaded up with the nutrients, and if a storm comes along that's too large for them to hold the water in the lake without the dike potentially bursting catastrophically, they relieve that water pressure by sending it out the canals. And when that reaches the coast, it causes the algal blooms, the red tides, all those are tied into the nutrients. And they can also be tied into wastewater, but in this case, it's primarily nutrients.
Okay, nice. Thanks for clarifying that up. What about I've heard a lot about the sugar, that the sugar factories were dumping water. Do you think that has any effect into it? I'm not sure exactly what they're dumping into the water, or I guess it's their wastewater, perhaps?
I don't know much about what sugar is up to in terms of their discharges, but when you're talking about an agricultural production like that, it's probably mainly dominated by nutrients. The problem is that the ocean is full of microscopic creatures, whether they are plants or phytoplankton or whatever. And when you give some of these things nutrients, they grow like crazy. And that in and of itself is not necessarily a deleterious occurrence, but when they begin to carpet the ocean along the coasts and they persist, what happens is that it cuts off the sunlight, and creatures living underneath, maybe not so much on the Gulf side, but on the other coast, on the East Coast, it could kill off things like corals or other creatures that need sunlight, and it can also basically bind up in its process of growing and decaying and falling to the bottom. It also can absorb a lot of the oxygen. And so you have a situation where you have no sunlight and you have potentially very low oxygen levels. And then things like higher life forms, invertebrates like fish and such will start to die off as well. And then the last layer on that is the human health risk, which is related in some of these different types of algae to toxins that they produce. They actually, especially blue-green algae, is known for its cyanotoxins. Cyan is blue-green. So cyanotoxins and these things can essentially kill fish. They can cause contact illnesses to people's skin, and in some cases, it can even give anaphylactic shock and things like that. So yeah, it's but at the root, it's really a water quality issue. In some bodies of water, I think that you're going to have a hard time ever getting rid of it unless you completely cut off the nutrient source. It has to do also there with the mixing. An example of that would be maybe a place like any kind of embayment that's kind of on the west coast of Florida. A lot of the embayments are very shallow, and they don't have a lot of mixing going on. And that mixing from wind and waves and tides is what typically turns over the water column and introduces oxygen and keeps things running healthily. But if they have this carpet of algae, it kind of keeps that system from doing what it would normally do. And so systems like that are particularly sensitive to a heavy nutrient load and take much longer to recover.
Now, is that something that you believe they could be doing a better job with better watershed management, especially with these nutrient-rich waters that are coming down? Is this something that could potentially be maybe not 100% solved, but reduced by introducing more systems to treat the water before it makes its way out there? Or is this something that, just due to the huge agricultural benefit and how many farms are kind of down in that area utilizing all these nitrates and sulfates to put into the soil, that it's just going to be something that is kind of tough to solve?
Well, I think that they definitely could change their practices, but it's a tough nut to crack for anybody, because you tell the farmer that he has to cut his nitrates or whatever, that directly is going to relate to what his agricultural production is. But if you think about it from just a more global perspective, and not just Florida, it's a problem everywhere. And I think that people's thoughts will eventually evolve on that, and what are the trade-offs? Because every decision that people make, of course, it comes with some consequence. And so whatever it is that it might be done about reducing nutrients, I think it's going to affect some other aspect of people's lives, and it just depends how much they value that. So maybe having who's to say?
Yeah.
But maybe having vine-ripe tomatoes in Minnesota available on the shelves in December is something that people could do without. I mean, I do remember, that when I was a kid, things were more seasonal. You got them when they were growing, and modern agricultural system, they they can, if they have the right climate, they can grow things pretty much year-round. I mean, in Florida, there's 4 growing seasons, basically the whole southern half of the state. And so, it's a supply and demand type of situation. But, yes, I do think there could be things done that would benefit the water quality. And at a watershed scale, if you look in places where it's kind of more obvious, like let's say the somewhere in the Northeast where you have some mountains and hills and things, a watershed in those cases is mostly very easily to define by the topography. And the idea that wherever you are in that watershed, whether you're at the very top of the watershed, where at the higher elevations, or whether you're down at the bottom where everything's draining out into some creek or the bay or whatever, essentially knowing that what you're putting on the ground or into the ground is eventually going to end up coming, it's going to get into the water and it's going to move down the watershed. And often it's going to produce some cumulative impact. And when you think of it that way, it's, in my opinion, it's worth rethinking the way that we do some of this stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, that's definitely pretty cool. I definitely agree. I think there's definitely some better practices we could be implementing throughout not only America, but probably over the entire globe. And what's one thing that your average person, let's just say down in Florida, what's one thing your average person could do to sort of help this issue? Is there any one thing that maybe as a collective society we're unknowingly doing that sort of adds to the issue and adds to the problem?
Yeah, I think there's, in terms of water, there's 2 things that you see just ubiquitously in a place like Florida. One is that people use way more water than they need to use, and most of it's for having green lawns. And right alongside that is that they fertilize their lawns like crazy, and cutting back on watering, and a lot of the places in Florida have regulations about that type of thing. But I used to live in the Tampa area, for example, and if you had the money to pay for the water, they would sell it to you. So it was a progressive scale, but I'll never forget that they used to put people's names in the paper every week or month, I guess it was, every month of who paid the highest water bills. And at that time, George Steinbrenner had his Tampa home right on Tampa Bay, and a big place, and he always had the highest water bill because he had the money to pay for it. But whether that makes sense or not, I don't think that it necessarily does. And so I think conservation, just smart conservation. I'm not talking about everybody needs to have their front yard look like a desert. But along with that comes growing things. If you're going to grow things that would normally grow in a given location. I think that's also something that's kind of common sense. If you have to force it to grow by piling, just loads and loads of water on it and loads of nutrients, it maybe could be a better crop or a better plant for you to grow.
Yeah, no, I
So,
definitely agree with that. Definitely can agree with conserving water. I think that's a very good point to touch on. So I kind of want to switch topics here a little bit now. Do you still have time here? I know we're already at like about an hour, so I know.
yeah,
Okay, cool.
sure.
So, all right, so I want to switch topics here with you, Tim. I want to talk a little bit more about a side that is less seen in the public eye, but I think just as critical to maintaining health for everybody as well as clean water. And I think the mining industry, where it sounds like you've done a little bit of work in there, has some big challenges of especially like you were saying as a child with the ponds. They kind of just contain all the mine waste. And I think it's important to kind of touch on how important proper care of that is, and mine water management, and sediment transport, remediation support, and why all that stuff is kind of important to us. Even though I know most people will never see a mine run in their life, I think it indirectly has more impact on them than they may realize.
Yeah, so there are, I don't even know the number, but I would guess tens of thousands of abandoned mines in the United States. And it's something that a lot of people just aren't aware of. I would say west of the Mississippi, people are probably more aware of mining. It's a more conspicuous business out in the West. But if you're not even talking, just for a second, to table modern-day mining, and you just look at the mines that have been around, for many of them for more than 100 years, that really all got started with most conspicuously with the gold rush and the 49ers and everybody heading out west to find their fortunes and that type of thing. And the style of mining there that was originally used was, of course, they're going after gold, but they're used what they call placer mining, which is looking for sediment that has gold in it and then washing it through basically sieves, essentially, that trap the gold and allow them to extract it. And however, what happened there was very quickly a lot of the big placer deposits kind of petered out, and so they started going underground trying to follow veins of gold. And it's not just gold, but all kinds of mining that occurred over all those many years. There was really no regulation of what to do with a mine after you were done with it. Maybe at most they would just kind of put some metal bars on the main entrance and a sign for people to stay out or something like that. So where the big environmental and health issue comes in related to water is the fact that any of these underground mines and also many of the above ground mines, when they're abandoned, they fill with water because the miners are typically dealing with excess water and they're pumping to keep them dry while they're in there operating. And when the water comes in, many of the minerals that are there, either what they were actually going after or minerals that are found in concert with the economic minerals that they were seeking, the water comes in and it changes the what we call the redox conditions, the reducing or oxidizing conditions inside the mine, and the water starts to turn from kind of a normal middle range pH 7 type water into something that's very acidic, or in some cases maybe very basic. In either case, a water that you could never drink, and that if it were exposed to the environment, to animals or plants and things like that, it would kill them or cause serious problems. And so there's just a lot of those types of places, especially in the West. I'd say lots of smaller ones in the West, some really huge ones too. But in the East, your predominant, if you look at the acidic water produced in a situation like that, that's what they call acid mine water. And in the East, that's mostly found in coal mining operations, underground coal mining operations that have been abandoned. And that water, if it escapes the mine, which can happen as the mine fills up and just water naturally seeks a low point and finds a way out, then you end up with streams being polluted by essentially very acidic water. And when I say very, there are mines in Pennsylvania, for example, that have water coming out of them in the range of 1 to 4 pH, 1 being a very almost, that'd be a very strong, let's say, equivalent to like sulfuric acid. And so you can imagine that wreaks havoc on the environment. And the reason historically was not only the mining rush kind of setting the stage for this, but it also had to do with, and to this day has to do with that when mines are permitted, they need to get a bond. And the bond for all those old sites from the 1800s or even earlier, there was no bonding. And the bond, of course, is essentially a set aside of money to properly close the mine. But in my estimation, to this day, their mines are not being properly bonded, and that has to do with the regulation from the federal government side more so than the operators, in my opinion, because it's a balance. If a guy came in and wanted to mine someplace, and I don't know, in my experience, the big companies are better at dealing with the present and future risks, but it's the small and mid-sized guys that will start a mine and just walk away from it. And there's so many of those, especially out west. So it's a tough situation because the money that would be needed to actually clean these things up is it's just an insane amount of money. It's not going to happen. At least the way it's set up right now. So.
And what do you think the number one problem, or for all these mines that are left there, what's the number one issue that we should, just as a general person, kind of be aware of and maybe try to be more thoughtful or mindful of? Obviously, there may not be much they can do, but maybe they can all push towards some sort of legislation, or what do you think we should all kind of be thinking at least about?
Well, this gets to my feelings on every action has a consequence, and one of them in this technological age is that those people that are out there mining are not doing it for fun. They're doing it for profit, and the profit is coming from the huge demand for primarily metals to be used in our modern world, in circuitry and all the underpinnings of our modern world. And so as consumers, I think people should be more aware that when they get that $800 iPhone, that all that complex technology in there came from the earth. It came from raw materials, and there were consequences to the recovery of those materials. I think that there's so many things that we have in modern society where we don't give it a thought about where did it come from. And I think there's just generally, if society would reflect on that a little bit more, maybe people wouldn't stand in line for that $800 iPhone as much.
Yeah, no, I can definitely agree. I think
you see what I'm saying? You get my point?
There's a lot of. I feel like everybody, like to point on what you're talking about. Everybody's getting a new laptop every 2 years. They're getting a new cell phone every year, and I think a lot more could be done to recycle our goods or to repurpose our goods, or to. I'm sure there's got to be a graveyard somewhere out there. In the same sense as there is cell phones and laptops, how many planes are probably sitting in a graveyard, or cars that are made sitting there that never sold? And is that something that we as a people can start to be more aware of? Maybe we would end up making better decisions. Instead of upgrading our car every 5 years, maybe we'll hold on for another 5.
Yeah, I guess my the way I framed it sounds a little harsh, but I just read an article the other day about how the recycling market is completely falling apart, and it has to do with market forces. Currently, maybe the last 30 years, the recycling market has been driven by China and their need for a lot of these materials that are in the electronics and things like that. But they have, within the last several years, discovered some very large deposits that can provide these things directly for them, and so they're not doing as much recycling of other people's waste. And so that kind of takes that option off the table, and so I think there always has to be some kind of market incentive for somebody to get involved and run with it. I think that people will personally, on a personal level, they'll do things because they think it's right, or they have a moral conviction, or whatever. But to get things done at the scale that they need to be done, it takes some sort of incentive, that's driving it, because we're not. It's not like everybody's rounding up the recycling in my neighborhood and taking it to some guy down the street. Everything's global now, so it's there has to be some driver. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this is more, it's definitely less of a risk in the U.S., but in general, the other big risk, and this gets to the flooding issue and the mine waste issue, are tailings ponds. And a tailings pond is where basically a wet stream of waste from the mine, so this is kind of like a slurry, like wet concrete or something would look like, is put into vast holding areas that have dams constructed by the mining companies. And there's been within the last 5 years, there's been some catastrophic failures of these tailings dams. Okay, And these have happened for the most part, underdeveloped countries where maybe the regulations are not as rigorous as in the U.S. And these dams, and if you're not familiar with this, you should look it up because it's kind of fascinating. Some of these dams are many times the size in terms of height and in terms of the volume of material that they're holding than like the Hoover Dam or some of our bigger hydro dams in the U.S. They're enormous, and they're not concrete dams. They're made of the material that's been brought out of the mines and essentially laid across a valley, bridging across a valley and then filling behind. And I think that the ones in Brazil over the last few years that have failed killed a lot of people. And these are people living in pretty poor economic conditions and not even aware that they're downstream of this potential hazard. And it's not the kind of thing either with it being the tailings dam. When that goes, it's like having it's a mud flow, okay, and that carries a lot more momentum and a lot more energy with it than does just water. If just a water dam were to break, so houses, people, roads, cars, and the earth itself are just wiped clean by something like that. So I think there needs to be an awareness of tailings dams, and I think they need to be properly constructed. That's probably a pretty obvious statement if you know what I'm talking about, but just I think people should know.
No, I definitely agree. And speaking of this, I don't know how familiar you are with. Did you happen to see it in Colorado where that one dam broke that was holding back all the tailings piles from this one mine, and all that orange solution flooded into the river?
That was the Gold. That was the Gold King mine, and ironically, there was EPA work going on there, and the EPA contractor basically stuck a hole in the side of the hill. And as I had talked about earlier, these old underground mines flood. And so behind that side of the hill where he was excavating was basically a mountain full of acid water. And when he poked the hole through, it summarily blasted out of there under high pressure and eventually collapsed the whole side of the hill and went into the river there, which was tributary to the Colorado, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe it was.
And
what?
Yeah. So
what do you think of the long-lasting? Oops, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you have at least a dual problem there. One is the immediate flood and just poor water quality, which would have been probably pretty acidic. And then the second is the sediment. And the sediment is kind of people don't think of that as much as they do the water. They're like, they think about drinking the water. They think about maybe the fish living in the water and things like that. But if you're any organism living downstream and your place that you live gets covered with mud, it's a bad day for you if it doesn't kill you outright. So, a similar situation happened with the down in I can't remember if the spill was actually in North Carolina or in Virginia, but in far southwestern Virginia, North Carolina border, there was a Duke facility down there that had a similar structure to what I was speaking about with the tailings ponds. It's a coal ash pond, and so it's another kind of low berm type structure built to hold the what's called fly ash, which is the leftover from burning coal at a coal electric generation facility. And that structure failed, and it washed out, I think, 87 miles of river.
Wow.
And coated the river, because of course this is a flood wave. It happened basically instantaneously for all intents and purposes. And it coated all that length of river from side to side and up the banks by many feet with this coal ash. It would be kind of equivalent to the Gold King mine sediment, except in this case it's coal ash. It's a little finer, so it almost makes like a mud, and that just smothered everything. It killed everything down the whole length there. So these structures and the way I think that the materials are handled both in operational phases and also in closure of any of these facilities, whether it's a mine or coal facility like that, it needs to be much more sound.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. That definitely does. Hey, Tim, I just wanted to let you know that was good. I'm going to say, if you still have, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, we can do a quick one about the professional development.
Sure.
I don't know what your time frame is here. Okay, that'd be awesome. I'm just going to do like a little sign off here for you real quick. I'll probably, like I said, clip this into 2 segments. One for World Water Day, which I'll use everything that we just talked about, and then I'll use this one as more of a secondary, just when I post, so it can be like a short, maybe 10-minute clip where people can just come and hear some of the professional development side for the younger guys.
Okay.
Well, I just wanted to thank you so much, Tim, for joining the show. You were very informational, and you touched on a lot of great topics today, and I think hopefully a lot of people will take away a lot of great information from this, and hopefully kind of inspire people to change the way that they really look and think about water in every aspect, and realize how important it is not only for our life but for society, and how important it is to be mindful of how much water we use, what we're putting in the water, what we're putting down the drain, and kind of all about mining aspect, and maybe to be mindful of the products we purchase and how often we purchase them, and kind of do a little bit of a better job to take care of things. So I really appreciate you coming on for the show, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I appreciate it. It was very interesting, and I look forward to hearing more of your podcasts.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tim.
Rock Talk, the podcast, is produced by GeoWonks. Go to geowonks.com and join the community.